Presumptive testing is tests that we do at the crime scene that are cheap, quick, and can rule out a lot of false positives. So for example, at a murder scene where there's lots of things that look like blood, we will do a test at the crime scene that we can do in 20-30 seconds that will rule out a lot of things that look like blood but aren't blood. So we have the test using there's one that we can spray on the walls, and there's one that we can do on the end of a swab. The one that we do on the walls uses a phosphorescent reaction. So if there is an enzyme or a catalyst there that can speed up the reaction of the chemical, then it will give off a phosphorescence. It will glow. They do this on large areas to see how far the blood has gone, if it is blood. Now there are some things that also catalyze the reaction other than blood. These will be things like some metals. There will be some things like bleach. These will also catalyze the reaction, so they will also give off a glow. So it's not a perfect test. It doesn't say this is definitely blood. It says it could be blood, and if it is blood, it's covering this area. We also have the test that we do on the end of a swab, and we'll do that to test a small patch, okay? Because if we're going to take a sample for DNA, that costs a couple of £100 every time we send it for DNA. Whereas if we can do a test that tells us whether it is or not blood for 50p, we'll test it, because if it's not blood, we ain't going to send it for DNA. Okay, the test that we were most likely to do, the Kastle-Meyer test. Okay, so the Kastle-Meyer test is the one that you see a lot on things like CSI. They will swab a suspected sample of blood, and this could be something that's red or pink or brown or black, because that's the colours that blood goes when it dries. They'll put a little bit of moisture on the end of the swab. They'll swab the sample. They will then add the Kastle-Meyer reagent to the sample on the swab, and if there is an enzyme there that will catalyze the reaction, it will go bright purple. Okay, this enzyme that we are looking for is actually hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a protein which carries oxygen around the body. It acts as an enzyme when you have the Kastle-Meyer test. So if hemoglobin is present, it will always turn purple. Even if it's only a very tiny amount of blood, it will always turn purple, because it's acting as an enzyme. It doesn't get used up in the reaction. So a very small amount will always give you a positive. Unfortunately, there are some things that also give you a positive. These include things like bleach. They include things like animal blood, because obviously they've also got hemoglobin in. They include a few metals and a few other things. But it helps us rule out the large majority of stains which are not blood. That's why it's useful. Okay, you also have presumptive tests for saliva and semen, and you can do it for some poisons. For saliva, we have the Fidibus test, which is made up of a very thin layer of starch paper with a blue dye in between, another thin layer of starch paper. If someone has spat at someone, it's classed as assault, and we can prove that that has happened by taking the clothing, putting the starch paper over the top of the clothing, spraying it with a thin layer of water that will soak through the paper, and if there is any amylase on the clothing, it will break through the starch and release the blue dye, and we'll see the areas where the spit is on the clothing by a blue pattern on the paper. This doesn't prove whose spit it is, but it tells you where then to look for the DNA of the presumed assailant, the suspect. The presumptive test for semen is very similar to the presumptive test for blood. It is again looking for a specific enzyme, and this enzyme is found in large concentrations in semen. However, it is also found in small concentrations in female bodily fluids. So it can only be used to help the investigation. You would never give a conviction based on a presumptive test. The presumptive test allows you to then choose where to specifically apply qualitative testing or quantitative testing, where to look for DNA, whether to send it for DNA. Okay? It doesn't tell you whose body fluids it is. Any questions?
What to do if it's only a small sample of blood?
If it's a very small sample of blood, and because this is a destructive technique, okay, it destroys the evidence because you're adding something to it. In a serious crime, we would send it straight for DNA. So if there's not enough for you to take a sample, test it, and then still be able to do DNA somewhere else, we would just send it for DNA just in case. The trouble is now is that DNA techniques are so specific, we can find 1 or 2 cells of DNA and get a profile from it, which means contact DNA is easily things. This is where if you shake someone's hand, and then that person shakes another person's hand, your DNA will be on someone's hand even though you haven't touched them. If they then go to the bathroom and they're a bloke, they will then put that DNA on their underwear. So we have to be very careful now when we're looking at DNA profiles, because a very small amount of DNA can get everywhere. Any other questions?
With regards to the dye, for blood, what's the enzyme that's checked?
We're looking for hemoglobin, which we know it's not normally classed as an enzyme, but it acts as an enzyme in the decomposition of a chemical called phenylalanine in the Castle-Meyer reagent.